series talk of the dispensation of the Bab. And I have a pleasure to introduce Bahhaj Hockley to everyone. I've known Bahhaj for many years, and as I've known his parents for probably over 30 years. He served on the Grand Canyon Baha'i Conference Committee for the last 7 years together. And I have to tell you that he always, every year, he comes up with a unique idea to improve the conference. And I can promise you that you will see that uniqueness tonight in his talk. We also are in the same industry. We both work in aerospace. He graduated from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, got his aerospace engineering over there, and then he got his master's in business administration from the second best school in Arizona. The University of Arizona.
AAU's number one, right?
From the bottom, yes. He also recently started a task force effort to pursue administrative and technological enhancements to our organizations and institutions with the intent of looking for opportunities to improve the processes and tools with which we carry out the vital and growing work of the faith in the 21st century. I know that he's actually working on a couple of softwares to help us out, help me out in the treasure stuff. And also he's looking into see, is there a way that we can have the voting electronically done? So that's really good. Also, some of you might have heard him talk in a fireside about the globalization of the Baha'i faith. So I know I talked to some of you, and you guys were very impressed. Without further ado, I will please join me to welcome Bahhaj.
Thank you. It seems rather oddly self-serving when I hear somebody else read it from what I wrote, but thank you very much. So I figured I'd start off with something I seem to have to caveat lately. I had nothing to do with the 737 MAX software. That unfortunately was all Boeing. I don't work on that airplane. Anyway, does anybody recognize any of these quotes by chance? First one actually is Mahatma Gandhi. Second one is Queen Marie of Romania, and then Helen Keller, and then Leo Tolstoy. There's a funny story actually about the quote from Tolstoy. When I was reading the flyer that went out last week for this talk, I saw that it mentioned the name Leo Tolstoy, and I had no quotes from Leo Tolstoy in this talk, so Kana, that one is for you right there. There's actually a reason for that I didn't include anything by Leo Tolstoy. Several reasons, I suppose. One of the reasons is, I think a lot of people are aware that Tolstoy was very interested in the faith, and he was interested in religion in general, pursued, especially to his later life and his literary career, spiritual enlightenment, and researched a lot about the Baha'i faith and the Mormon faith, actually. That, of course, is a second-hand quote. It's reportedly something he mentioned to somebody who was interviewing him. But part of the reason I haven't gone necessarily the route of some of the more famous mentions of the faith is because, one, the purpose of this series of talks is specifically to focus on the ministry of the Bab, which is largely, and I'll get into this in some of the later slides, but I think there's sort of a lack of focus, and not for any other reason other than we tend to focus on the manifestation of the day, and that is, of course, Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. And so the early ministry is sort of glossed over to a large respect in that we say, okay, well, yes, the Bab came because the teachings of the Baha'u'llah were so transformative that it kind of needed to help humanity along, and we needed to have a forerunner for the Baha'i faith, right? So this series of talks, and this talk in particular, is designed to focus on what we sort of overlook in terms of the early history of the faith, and specifically how it transformed the external community, right? The community outside of the faith. And so you'll see some of those elements in here. Of course, this is not by any means exhaustive, right? There's actually a lot more references than I thought when I initially started researching this topic. So you'll see some of those when we get into it. All right, so phases of the Bab's ministry. Nader Saidi, which many of you are probably familiar with, is a prominent scholar in the Baha'i community. Generally highlights 3 phases of the Bab's ministry. And of course, these 3 phases are his life, right? The early phase, 1844 to 1846, when his initial pronouncement, right, where the letters of the living are discovering him independently. And then, of course, Mullah Hussein being the first letter of the living. And then 1846 to 47, a phase of philosophical analysis, metaphysical analysis, and his writing, his prominent writings, the Bayan and so on. And then 47 to 50, of course, the era of legislation, and of course, ending in the martyrdom of the Bab. So this is, of course, is limited to his life, but certainly his impact extended beyond his martyrdom, as we know. And so this history and the story that you'll see is largely prominent events that affected the globe, right, that were reported on across the globe between 1845 to 1866, after which, of course, Baha'u'llah was continued to as the successor of the faith and the Baha'i faith, and then scholarly analyses from there tended to focus on the Baha'i faith as a whole and the successorship. So this is kind of looking at the early history. So this is one aspect of it, right? And this is sort of the Baha'i scholarly aspect. The other side, right, for looking at this from sort of an external perspective of what the Babi ministry and the Babi movement kind of entailed, there has been analyses done on what this was from a traditional social movement perspective. And of course, there are different categories. There's generally 6 that are identified and 6 types of social movements. And they tend to focus on what the primary target was, the target audience. Whether or not use of force is permitted is largely a factor in the type of social movement. And then who's expected to implement the change. And of course, you've got 6 different types there, and I won't go through the exhaustive list, but they vary based on whether or not these certain aspects are permitted or expected. And for the Babi movement, the general understanding is that initially it was a bargaining type of movement. The target was social structural change. It was, in the beginning, nonviolent. And it was the implementation for change was supposed to be societal, right? Of course, as we know, there was heavy resistance to the Babi movement and the message of the Bab and his followers, right? And so, as turbulence started to impact the believers, there was a variety of passions, I will say, with respect to the way the Babi's followers carried out their understanding of the message of the Bab. And so it waned into a more disruptive type of movement where isolated incidences of violence were known, right? We know there was the misguided attempt on the life of the Shah. There was the Battle of Fort Tabarsi, right? So there are incidents where there are pockets of violence that did occur. And so after the martyrdom of the Bab and had the direction of the Babi movement was in question, there were incidents where the Babi movement flexed into a disruptive sort of movement. So this is the external perspective, right? If you looked at it from sort of an external viewpoint on of what the movement looked like to the rest of the world. So as I was researching this and continuing to find examples of kind of an academic viewpoint of what the Babi movement looked like to the rest of the world, the question came up, well, why does it matter? And I don't mean that as in any sort of blasphemous sort of question. But as I kind of alluded to in the beginning, most of us know, okay, the Bab was the first of the twin manifestations for this day. We know that the Bab, the gate, served as the herald for Baha'u'llah, right? We know the various accounts internal to the faith of the early believers, the martyrdom of the Bab, and so forth. So what else is there to look at? Most of us, most of the time we say, okay, well, Baha'u'llah is the manifestation of the day, and that's where our focus is. What are the teachings of the manifestation for today, and how do we share those with the rest of the world? So beyond the question was, to me, as I was continuing to research this, so what's significant about focusing on the ministry that heralded the manifestation for today, right? And I think for me, what I came to at the end of this, and what I hope I will also be able to share with you, is that in order to answer this question, we kind of have to look at the first 15 years and what that impact looked like to the rest of the world. What was reported in the rest of the world? How was it seen by the rest of the world? And why is that significant? So, my video player is
21 March 1844. It is the special and constant intention of His Highness the Sultan that his cordial relations with the high powers be preserved, and that a perfect reciprocal friendship be maintained and increased. The Sublime Porte engaged to take effectual measures to prevent henceforward the execution and putting to death of the Christian who is an apostate.
all right. So most people probably wouldn't think this would be where you would start when you're looking at history of the Babi movement. I will be illumined shortly. Okay. But actually, there is a reason that this is where a lot of scholars start when they're talking about this period of history. And it's because it's seen, the Edict of Toleration, which is what you heard, or part of what you heard, is actually seen as a fulfillment of prophecy by a lot of people. For Jewish religious scholars, Christian religious scholars, it signifies the end of the persecution and banishment of Christians and Jews from the homeland, right? From the region, the Ottoman. Well, at this point, it was the Ottoman Empire. So it's seen by, like I said, it's seen by many as a fulfillment of religious prophecy. And actually, and again, it's mentioned in the Baha'i faith as well. The proclamation of his faith was made in 1844. Now, no coincidence, of course, that it's 1844. At the same time, the Edict of Toleration is declared. And when the strict exclusion of the Jews from their own land enforced by the Muslims for some 12 centuries was at last relaxed by the Edict of Toleration. So this is seen as kind of the start of the indication that something significant is happening. And of course, you can kind of put the pieces together in hindsight. But again, it is seen as significant that 1844 was the same time, of course, that the Bab declared his mission. Next video.
23rd February 1846, a new sect has lately set itself up in Persia, at the head of which is a merchant who had returned from pilgrimage to Mecca and proclaimed himself a successor of the Prophet. We have news of such matters in Shiraz from the following account. 4 persons being heard repeating their professions of faith according to the form prescribed by the impostor were apprehended, tried, and found guilty of unpardonable blasphemy. They were sentenced to lose their beards by fire being set to them. The sentence was put into execution with all the zeal and fanaticism becoming a true believer in Muhammad. Not deeming the loss of beards a sufficient punishment, they were further sentenced the next day to have their faces blackened and exposed through the city. Each of them was led by an executioner who made a hole in his nose with a string in it, which he sometimes pulled with such violence the unfortunate fellow cried out alternatively for mercy from the executioner and vengeance from heaven. It is the custom in Persia, on such occasions, for the executioners to collect money from the spectators, and particularly from the shopkeepers in the bazaars. In the evening, when the pockets of the executioners were well filled with money, they led the unfortunate fellows to the city gate, where they were turned adrift.
So funny detour story there. Most of you probably didn't think of this because you're not crazy like I am. But I actually Googled it after I created this video. Turns out the radio wasn't invented until 1895. So radio voice doesn't really make sense there. But I'd already done it, so. But yeah. So this event, that story was actually in 56 newspaper articles around the world. And the source is largely attributed to a letter from Shiraz dated August 10th, 1845. And doing a bit of digging, actually, the four Babis mentioned, we know that Qudus was the 18th letter of the living, of course, was in Shiraz for his final meeting with the Bab. And in fact, in God Passes By, Qudus and Mullah Siddiq are mentioned. There's no mention of the other two, but there you are. And it is noted that this incident began to echo around the world and in the UK starting in November 1845 and continuing through 1846. So this is sort of the first indication, the first stirring that something is occurring, right, in Persia. And of course, the early mentions of this sort of uprising, as it was referred to, it mentions that, Babism is a sect and doesn't really identify the magnitude, of course, of the Bab's movement. But as you would sort of expect, it takes time for the realizations and those sort of inspirations to flow. But these are the first mentions are largely referring to it as a social movement. That there's something that's attracting progressives to sort of, there's a striking dichotomy between the government of Persia at the time. Right, next story.
14 October 1847. The internal affairs of Persia are in a most deplorable state. Khorasan is in open rebellion, and Kherson and Shiraz both show symptoms of following their example. In the first named country, the rebels have already 25,000 troops, prepared to resist any force which the Shah may send against them.
October 1847. Accounts from Persia speak of the unsettled condition of Isfahan, which is described as being in a wretched state of misrule. The whole of the inhabitants, excepting the merchants and people interested in the maintenance of order, have risen in rebellion against the Shah. Khorasan and Mashhad were in the same unsatisfactory state as at the date of the latest advices from those provinces. It is believed that a rebellion of more than ordinary importance is forming in those misgoverned countries, in which some of the principal nobles are said to be deeply committed.
All right, so the Khorasan rebellion and many like this were occurring around this time in Persia, and it's a lot of analysis, a lot of the early stories related the two, right? The Babi movement they related it to these social uprisings, but there's actually a lot of speculation as to whether or not the Babis were involved in any meaningful capacity in this event, and in fact, there is evidence to suggest that they weren't. We know that Mullah Hussein was directed by the Bab to Khorasan during this period, but we also know of the account from the Dawnbreakers. During his time in Mashhad, a rebellion against the government of the Shah broke out in Khorasan, involving an alliance between local Kurdish tribes and the Sheriff of Mashhad. Mullah Hussein learned that the leader of the rebellion hoped to secure his support as a representative of the growing Babi community, and decided on leaving Mashhad to avoid entangling the local Babis in the chaos expected to result when the forces of the Shah eventually arrived. These kinds of events were not isolated. The Babis and the Babi movement in general was largely seen as very progressive, in comparison, of course, to the government of the time. And so events like these where progressives who were not affiliated with the Babi community in any way, though knew, of course, of their activities and their teachings, assumed that they would be natural allies. And of course, the Babis, the prominent leaders at the time of the Babi movement, had to tread this fine line between not engaging in what was seen as simple social uprising, and of course distinguishing themselves as separate from those movements, because of course they were after a greater social change, a spiritual awakening. And so this is one instance. You can clearly see that fine line was difficult to tread. And of course, despite their best efforts, it was still seen as affiliated with the Babi movement until you really do some further research. On the whole, it's likely that there were some Babis that were involved. Certainly, progressive movements such as these were very impassioned. But it is clear that there was no intent to support these uprisings in the beginning of this.
On one occasion, when the representative of Russia at the Persian court was waiting to be summoned to the presence of the king, he was alarmed by hearing loud cries in his immediate neighborhood in the palace garden. And as he was proceeding to the audience chamber, he encountered a number of executioners dragging along the still palpitating bodies of some men who had been strangled. The prince was shocked beyond measure, and he was, with reason, offended at the indignity which had been offered to him in his being summoned to the royal presence at such a moment. He therefore expressed in strong terms to the Shah and to his minister his opinion as to the barbarousness of the usage by which executions were conducted before the eyes of the sovereign. The Emir-i-Nizam fully concurred in the opinion of the Russian minister on this subject, and he accordingly at once determined to put a stop to the practice complained of. It was feared, however, that a commotion might be excited by the unusual spectacle of men being publicly executed at Tehran. But on the occasion of putting the Babi conspirators to death, no such commotion took place. Some doubts existed in the minds of the people as to whether the alleged intentions of the conspirators had been fully proved against them, or whether it was right to punish for a mere intention as if for a crime that had been actually committed. But it could not be denied that the sentence of death upon these Babi backsliders from the Moslem faith was in accordance with Mohammedan law. Each of them was offered his life upon the simple condition of reciting the formula of the Moslem creed, but none of them consented to purchase pardon on such terms.
So as you can tell, I co-opted my family for some of these voiceovers. They were willing actors, semi-willing anyway. So this account is likely from Dmitry Dolgorukov, the Russian minister to Tehran. And at this time, the account that's reflected here, there was actually governmental pressure from Britain and Russia at this time, because these public executions, summary executions, were becoming much more prominent, and of course specifically beginning to target the Babis. And it's actually interesting to see these accounts directly from Dolgorukov and others showing the impact of foreign influence even at such an early time on the government of Iran. It's not explicitly stated, but it's likely that these executions were the 7 martyrs of Tehran, the ones that are specifically referred to in this account. The timing does line up, and that's generally accepted as highly likely that that's what he was referring to. And again, as I mentioned, the increased scrutiny from Britain and Russia on the pressure campaign on the Shah to end these practices. This event, of course, was really just happen chance that Dolgorukov was at the palace at the time that they were actually committing these executions, and of course, as stated, was horrified by the idea of hosting a formal diplomatic event while this is happening in the room next to him. It is a stark and interesting account to read. Again, and it also mentions that with the increased scrutiny, public trials were attempted, but it was largely understood that they were show trials. And at the end, of course, to mention that the ministry has incurred the hatred of the people by this system of violence and apparently arbitrary law. And the increase in violence and really the wanton application of these executions began to turn on the government itself. And this continued despite the attempts of the British and Russian governments to try to stem that tide. yeah, it's an interesting glimpse, I'll say. It was an interesting glimpse into to see diplomatic transcripts of these events, as we've read them, of course, in the history of the faith internally, but to actually see them externally from the people who essentially witnessed them.
London Morning Post. A new religious sect has arisen in Persia in consequence of the preachings of a man named Bab, who has written a new book to take the place of the Quran. He's said to have already made several thousand proselytes, and 18 of these Babis, as his followers are called, have been publicly beheaded by order of the king.
Alright, so this newspaper article was in the London Morning Post, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot on the surface that seems different from the other accounts. The one thing, though, this is the first reference, or one of the first references, that there is actually a new religious text associated with this movement. And in so doing, it starts to recognize the fact that this is more than just a social movement. This is more than the uprisings that have been seen in Persia for the past 10 years. And by this point, as I said, most of the references of the Baha'i movement have been attributed to social unrest, right? The dichotomy between progressive movement, again, of a younger generation against the oppression of an older government. This is the first stirrings of recognition that maybe this is more than just social unrest. This is something more significant. This could be truly the start of a new religion. It starts to imply that, and again, the London Morning Post looked at it, of course, so this is the UK, which, again, Britain and Russia kind of had the most diplomatic ties to the Persian kingdom at that time, so a lot of these accounts are from those arenas. They were the first to start reporting these, and then the echoes around the world followed that from there.
3rd September 1850, Morning Chronicle. We have dates from Tabriz to the 31st July, announcing the important fact that the Sheikh al-Islam of Azerbaijan, a very influential personage, as being one of the highest dignitaries of the Church of Persia, has been arrested and forcibly conveyed to Tehran by special order of the Emir Nizam, together with his son, under charge of intriguing to secure an extension of power to the clergy, to the manifest detriment of the state. Babiism, notwithstanding the recent execution of its chief and founder Bab, the Soi Distant, representative of Muhammad Mehdi, the 12th and last Imam, claiming direct succession from Muhammad, continues to increase, and its followers are said to number in Persia alone 50,000. The village of Zawijan, which is their stronghold, though only containing a population of 8,000, including women and children, continues to hold out against 5 regiments of well-disciplined troops, which have closely besieged it for the past 3 months, and in a late sortie, 200 of the latter were massacred. It is said that the inhabitants have put themselves in position as regards provisions and warlike stores to hold out for at least 2 years against even a much superior force.
Alright, so Zenjan upheaval. So I found it interesting when I came across this, and of course, as you can tell, this is chronological. This is one of the first mentions of the execution of the Bab, and it occurs in half a sentence in a newspaper article. And of course, it is a prominent part of the Baha'i faith, of course. It's the martyrdom of the Bab. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy to see something so impactful, and yet it's half a line in a newspaper article. Of course, it does note that the teachings of the Bab are far from quelled, and this seemed to be a continuous theme as articles and reports of the Babi movement continued to come out. There was definitely an early recognition that this isn't something that was fleeting and disbanding. This is something that was meaningful, impactful, and continuing. There's 16 known echoes of this story around the world, varying degrees of detail. One of the additions, actually, to this story was in 1851 adds the following paragraph. Paris papers contain accounts from Tehran, Persia, giving an account of the execution of the chief of the sect of the Babis at that capital. One of the dogmas of this sect has as the social equality of man and woman, and its followers, having taken up arms in defense of their creed, were aided by a regiment of about 1,000 women, who are represented to have used their muskets with very considerable effect in the engagements which took place with the royal troops, although ultimately overpowered. As I mentioned before, of course, the Babi faith did not explicitly reject the use of force, and in fact, in the early days, it did occur, and we know of stories, this being one of them. I did find it interesting that 1851, there is already special recognition of the social stature of women as being quite different from the beliefs of the government and, of course, the religion of the time in that region. This is 72 years before the suffrage movement in this country, so interesting to see that published. There is a slide that addresses the evolution of the equality of men and women, and as part of the reason why there was such a leap in the teachings between Islam and the Bab and then Baha'u'llah, of course. And we'll get into that in a later slide. But that was quite an interesting addition. Again, 72 years before success of the suffrage movement in this country. So pretty interesting to note.
In 1865, Dr. Jacob Polak published his first-hand account of the attempt on the life of the Shah and the execution of one of the Bab's chief lieutenants.
In late summer 1852, as the Shah, accompanied by an approximate guard of 500 men, underwent an outing from his summer palace, 3 men came towards him, whereupon one of them point-blank fired a pistol at him. The shot grazed the stomach of the Shah's horse. The guard appeared to back off, leaving him to his fate. Then everyone believed him to be dead and murdered at the hands of a pretender to the throne. Had there been a decaying corpse among the living, it would have seemed superfluous. Only one foreign servant noticed the Shah stirring. He lunged dauntlessly and seized one of the murderers. A fight arose in which the servant received a stab wound to the stomach. In the meantime, others trudged towards the murderers, and the king was saved. What resulted were only a few small grains of shot in the area of his backside. Of the assassins, one recognized fanatical Babis who wanted to avenge the death of their prophet. The pistol and the ammunition which they operated were so poor that only a miracle could have enabled them to realize their goal. The Shah immediately showed himself the wolf, in order to prevent malicious rumors. He retorted that God had saved him. Certainly God has saved me, because you all have forsaken me. Then began the persecution. The Shah was encouraged to believe in a further widely networked conspiracy of Babis, shut up behind regiments, servants, attendants, priests, teachers. In every direction he found plotters, and he was not for a moment without fear of his life. Even the wife of the Grand Vizier, born in Mazandaran, was accused of belonging to the sect. Seized by fear and horror from every side, the Shah lapsed into Machiavellian ways to exterminate the believers. In Tehran, there lived the highest of the royal Farash, Haji Ali Khan, a heartless man and ready on command for any atrocity. He gave him the instruction to seek out all Babis and throw them into jail. Then he ordered every corps, every branch of the civilian and military detail, to find and surrender at least one Babi. Haji Ali, an innovative mind, came up with the most abominable, crucifying methods of execution. The martyrs demonstrated the courage and steadfastness of fanaticism. No recanting of faith, no hint of a cry of pain. I was witness to the execution of Gurat al-Ain, who was executed by the war minister and his adjuncts. The beautiful woman endured her slow death with superhuman strength.
Okay, so a lot to digest there. Obviously, this is unfortunately, one of the most well-known examples of a use of force in the Babi movement. It spurred 123 known echoes. That's just the known echoes around the world. Very prominent newspapers, New York Times, The Guardian, The Morning Chronicle. The Guardian specifically notes, that is Shoghi Effendi, specifically notes that this episode was one that a sorely persecuted faith was about to be subjected through the shameful act of a fanatical and irresponsible Babi to a humiliation such as it had never before known. And then, of course, it's also mentioned in Nabil's narrative. Baha'u'llah is quoted as saying, "The event itself indicates the truth of the affair and testifies that this is an action of a thoughtless, unreasoning, and ignorant man." That analysis is generally accepted. It's concluded that this was the work of, unfortunately, militant Babis who felt splintered and disenfranchised after the execution of the Bab and were seeking revenge. Certainly, passions were high. And it's an unfortunate event, but it is one that, in some ways, I think was kind of necessary to spur the growth of the faith. It was not an isolated incident of violence. Unfortunately, it is one of the most prominent incidents of violence. Qurrat al-Ain, of course known as Tahrir, was one of the most notable figures to be personally targeted as a result of this failed attempt. She was, of course, a letter of the living, one of the 18. And as is written, she was taken to a nearby garden in Tehran and was strangled to death, actually, with her own veil. Quite a vivid picture. And of course, Dr. Polak, who wrote the account you heard, was actually described it as such, as a first-hand account. One of her most notable quotes actually is her final utterance: "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women." That quote, and of course, as you've seen before, the equality of men and women was one of the most striking social changes that the Babi movement was proclaiming. And you see that in the accounts of the faith as well, of course, with Tahira removing her veil at the conference of Bahhaj. This account, again, the equality of men and women, is one of the themes that was one of the most striking and progressive teachings of the Babi movement. And there's a example slide of that a little bit later on.
Excerpt from the book Glimpses of Life and Manners in Persia by Mary Shale, published 1856.
In reference to the 7 martyrs of Tehran, few believe that by these sanguinary measures the doctrines of the Bab will cease from propagation. There is a spirit of change abroad among the Persians, which will preserve his system from extinction, besides which his doctrines are of an attractive nature to Persians. Though now subdued and obliged to lurk concealed in towns, it is conjectured that the creed of the Bab, far from diminishing, is daily spreading. At the fitting time, the Bab will come to life again. There will be either a resurrection, or else his successor will maintain that his death was a falsehood invented by the Mussulmans. Whenever that day of desolation arrives, wading in blood will not be a figure of speech in Persia.
So Mary Shale and her husband were actually very culturally attached to the Persian community. They lived there for quite some time. And this excerpt is, the Babi movement actually is a chapter in the larger novel Glimpses of Life in Persia. And in general, analyses like these start to come out towards the end of the 1850s and later, that begin to recognize, beyond simply the news articles and the events of the day, that there is a persistent spirit of change, and it seems to be associated with the Babi movement. And it's inextricably linked. Many contemporary reflections, especially in the early days, fall short of really grasping the magnitude of the Bab's message. The teachings, they don't really place the movement in a spiritual context. It's seen, again, as I mentioned, as more of just a progressive social uprising. They do tend to give the Babis credit for advancing the cause of social change, but they fall short of recognizing the broader picture. The other thing that's of note here, Mary Shale is one of the first that starts to recognize, at least in passing, that there is something that's progressive. There's something that there is a successor, right? That the movement doesn't die with the martyrdom of the Bab. That there is something more to come. And of course, 1856, Baha'u'llah has not yet declared his mission, but there is an indication that she has to some point done her research and recognizes that the Babi movement is waiting, is searching and expecting the successor, of course, the promised one, as was promised. Again, as I mentioned, this fact is not noted in many early analyses of the Bab or the Babi movement. Many early analyses of the Babi movement contend that with the execution of the Bab, there was a general sense of disorder. And some go so far, of course, to suggest that the movement dies there. And of course, we know today that was not the case.
History of Persia from the beginning of the 19th century to the year 1858 by Robert Grant, published 1866.
Babism, though at present a proscribed religion in Persia, is far from being extinct, or even declining, and the Bab may yet contest with Muhammad the privilege of being regarded as the real prophet of the faithful. Babism in its infancy was the cause of a greater sensation than that even which was produced by the teaching of Jesus, if we may judge from the account of Josephus of the first days of Christianity. Far from foreseeing the future spread of that religion, the Jewish historian contents himself with observing,
"And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, Christ, are not extinct to this day."
So we, of course, have the fortune of hindsight. We know, of course, that the teachings of the Bab and the successor Baha'u'llah, of course, did not end in the turbulent times after the martyrdom of the Bab. And as I mentioned, later accounts begin to recognize this fact that it doesn't seem like this was a fleeting incident, that this is something that's growing. This actually, Robert Grant's account in 1866, this was the account that I chose to end on, again, as I mentioned, because from here, with the proclamation of Baha'u'llah as the promised one, of course, later accounts of the Baha'i faith tend to associate the two together, and as I mentioned, largely skip over perhaps what the focus of the Bab's mission was and why it was so essential. Grant, of course, draws parallels between the Babi movement and the early days of Christianity, as many do. Grant, of course, was a Christian, and when you tend to analyze events of the world, you come from your frame of reference, right? Grant goes so far, in fact, to describe the vigor and rapidity with which the Babi movement spread to that of Muhammad, rivaling that of Muhammad even. And though he falls short of stating it explicitly, Grant's comments begin to allude to the fact that the Bab's revelation and the spread of the movement, it's similar to the coming of Christ and Muhammad, in the sense that there is, although he may have inadvertently been suggesting it, there is kind of this truth regarding progressive revelation that there's a similarity to these manifestations, what the world looks like when they come into being and how they're treated, and how the movement struggles to grow and the persecution it undergoes. So he kind of starts to touch on this, and again, analyses from there begin to increasingly expand on this. And of course, with the coming of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith, the picture starts to become much clearer. The early days, the early days of reporting and analyses of these faiths, it's interesting to see the growth of understanding, especially in the wider community. So, back to the original question. Why does this matter? Well, we know the message of the Bab was revolutionary in comparison to Islamic doctrine of the time, and Baha'u'llah even more so. So the Bab's brief yet brilliant ministry really, in my view at least, was essential in bridging the gap to the evolutionary leap in spiritual consciousness that Baha'u'llah was to bring. It really is testing the waters, pushing the boundaries a little bit. And you can actually see this when you start to look at specific elements of the teachings of these faiths. So, how monumental was this leap? Okay, so a couple of examples. There are many more, of course. You look at Islam, right, the concept of jihad. If you do some research, do a little bit of investigation, generally accepted that there's two forms. Greater jihad, which is the pursuit of spiritual perfection. The lesser jihad, which unfortunately is more in the news. The combative fight to preserve and expand Islamic influence. That's an understood and described component of Islamic teaching, right? So the Babi ministry actually does comment on this idea of jihad as well, and reinterprets it to an extent. It's defined as the conditions under which a holy war would be permissible. They're much more stringent, and many scholars say, well, on the grounds of a religious war in that context, it would be impossible to achieve. It would be impossible to justify a religious war on those grounds. As we mentioned before, armed conflict was a facet of Babi history in some isolated incidents. So you can kind of start to see there that there is a struggle to adjust the societal norms, especially, and it's a leap for Babi believers, right? To adjust to the idea of having to perhaps justify the use of force to such a degree, right? And then, of course, in the Baha'i faith, the concept of use of force or coercion, in any form under the banner of the faith is forbidden. And so Babis, who had to then accept that Baha'u'llah was the manifestation for the day and were to become Baha'is, had to make this leap, right? They were Muslim, they believed in Islamic law. Then they said, okay, I believe in the Bab and the teachings of that time, and then if they were not martyred for their faith, had to say, okay, I accept Baha'u'llah now. So that's a big leap to happen in a relatively short amount of time, right? That's one example of how these teachings would evolve. And to make it to, I believe in the Baha'i faith, you would have to take that and accept it, right? And so that's difficult. Again, and the equality of men and women, which I've been mentioning a lot in this talk. Under Islamic law, right, there is a general acceptance that gender inequality is commonplace. Women are expected to be veiled, polygamy is permitted, right? At the time. Under the Babi ministry, gender equality is not explicitly stated. However, the status of women is elevated considerably. Women are no longer required to be veiled. You see the example of Tahara. And polygamy is discouraged. Right? So then under the Baha'i faith, gender equality is specifically stated as a fundamental tenet, right? And polygamy is explicitly forbidden. So you can see, again, this evolution in social acceptance, right? In, again, the same period of time, relatively short. So one who was fortunate enough to not be martyred for their faith, depending on how you look at it, would have to have made those successive leaps in understanding, in faith, in spiritual awakening, right? And so this is the monumental leap that we're talking about here. And when we say, well, okay, what was the significance of the Babi movement? This was it. Because to go from column 1 to column 3, maybe it was too big of a leap to make, right? All right, so I'll give a little preface to this chart. The phrase, the word perhaps is underlined and bolded because this is kind of an interpretation that my crazy brain came to, and certainly I want to highlight the fact that it's my interpretation. So As I kind of got to the end of this journey, putting this talk together, I got to thinking about the idea of revelation in general. We know from the Baha'i faith that our belief is that a manifestation comes when humanity is at its greatest need for spiritual awakening, right? It's at its need for growth. And so I can highlight a little bit here on this chart. So blue line there would be the path of spiritual progress. So by that interpretation, if manifestations come to us in a time of great human need for spiritual awakening, you'd see at the bottom of spiritual progress, right, when we are at our lowest in terms of spirituality and in need of spiritual enlightenment, a manifestation of God comes to us, right? The red line would be material progress. Materially, we see that we are actually growing considerably when these manifestations come to us, and our material growth explodes from there, right? In the mid 1800s to now, our material growth has grown considerably, exponentially. But the two cycles seem out of phase. As we grow materially, we seem to lag spiritually. And it seems interesting. There's sort of a disconnect between the two, as we tend to burn out materially. But as we know, right, if we're here on this chart, right, just after the point of spiritual awakening, the coming of the Baha'i faith, we're kind of in this slightly upward trend here. Materially, we've got plenty to go, but we know this point is coming. We've been told that, right, in the writings of the faith. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what it's going to be. But for some reason, it seems that these two cycles are out of phase, and yet it seems that would be in contrast to the Baha'i belief that science and religion must agree. And so perhaps this cycle of manifestation, right, that we've seen, where we have these monumental leaps in evolution and social progress, perhaps the real goal is to figure out why these two phases are out of sync and how we can bring them into alignment. That's the thought I'll leave you with for the evening. Oh, in case you're curious what it looks like to CSI Babi history, that was my brain to try and put this together. So.
Thank you, Alex, very much. I learned a lot. I didn't know a lot of things. So we have about 10 minutes allocated for Q&A. But I want to make sure we have two ground rules. One is that your questions should be very short. Second thing, they need to be questions, not comments. Okay? Questions. If you have questions, you bring it up. Afterwards, if you want to talk to him, make comments, but that's up to you.
I'm okay with comments. I didn't prepare for questions, so.
Was there any reason that you left out E.G. Brown, A.M. Nicholas, and Conto Copino?
So I guess I had to choose where to bound the talk. As I said, there's a lot of material, more than probably most of us would realize. There's a lot of references out there, and it was, of course, trying to fit this inside a 45 minute to an hour. I guess pretty early on, I made the choice to focus on what I thought was the less focused on part of the movement itself, right? And I think the early years, outside of the Baha'i faith, of course, for which the early years are very important, vitally important. The external references, the external view of those early years was a part that hadn't necessarily been looked at. And so I tried to focus on external accounts from those first 15 or so years. So I guess a brief answer to your question. For the same reason, I didn't necessarily include an in-depth analysis of Leo Tolstoy's references to the faith either.
There was a conference in, I can't remember what year, but it was 2 months after the Bahhaj conference in the US in New York, which was supposedly the first women's rights conference that occurred.
Seneca Falls.
Seneca Falls. Yeah. Just wondering if, like, it's coincidental yet interesting how it happened a couple months after Tahir's unveiling. Just wondering if you happen to look upon any kind of coincidences or things that were mentioned in that conference that coincided with that conference.
With the conference in
Bahhaj.
Yeah. There weren't, so there are certainly, there's certainly a lot of correlation regarding events of the early Babi movement and events around the world. And there are many analyses that look into areas like that, exactly as you mentioned. For example, the Edict of Toleration and those types of things where there's a global event that wouldn't really be taken as impactful unless you look at the overall context. The account, as you mentioned, of course, it is significant in the sense that this period of time where women's rights and women's movements around the world were increasing. There is significance to those events, and as you mentioned, I wouldn't say that it's pure coincidence. I do think there is a reason for those. The overall impacts and echoes of those events around the world, again, there are many, and you could certainly do a talk on those as well. But yeah, you're not wrong that there are definitely global echoes of these same types of occurrences, right? And it's telling that they're occurring at a time when this spiritual awakening, this spiritual movement brought by a manifestation of God in a local area, and yet you see these impacts all around the world. So, yeah, no, I would say that it's certainly not a coincidence.
Now, as you know, there are 3 more talks that are coming. Next week is going to be the Rank and Station of the Bab by Kana Chinasamy. And then the following Friday, 2 weeks from today, youth are going to talk about the life of the Bab. Okay. So with that, I'm going to end the program. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.